So when talking about diffusion-limited versus perfusion-limited gas transfer, the easiest way to think about it is to ask the question, do the partial pressures in the alveolar gas and capillary blood equilibrate during transit? If they do equilibrate, the gas is perfusion-limited, and if they don't equilibrate, the gas is diffusion-limited. What this means is that if the gas equilibrates, then it means no more gas will cross into the blood. So the only way to increase movement of gas from the alveoli to blood is to bring in more blood, which means the limitation here is perfusion of blood past the alveoli. But if the gas does not equilibrate across the alveoli in the time it has to transit, then bringing in more blood doesn't change anything. So the limitation here is the diffusion barrier, so this gas would be diffusion limited. And we can demonstrate this using a graph where on the y-axis we put partial pressure, and on our x-axis we'll have time in the capillary, or you can have on the left the start of the capillary and on the right the end of the capillary to represent the blood which will be moving from left to right across the capillary, which must happen over a time frame, which will still give you your time for the x-axis. And as we said before, for normal lungs at rest, the time that blood has to equilibrate is about 3/4 of a second, so 0.75 seconds or 750 milliseconds. We can also indicate a direction of change, so going from blood to alveolus or alveolus to blood. So anything where the line is going up, then it's going from alveolus to blood, and anywhere where the lines are heading down means that you're going from blood to alveolus. And any dashed lines indicate the partial pressure in the alveolus. That's going to be the equilibration point with the blood. So most people will jump into talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide when they talk about this graph, but I think to really understand the difference between diffusion-limited and perfusion-limited gas, we should talk about the extremes, and the first one we'll talk about is carbon monoxide, which is a diffusion-limited gas and is used in respiratory function tests for measurement of diffusion, and then we'll talk about nitrous oxide, which is a gas we use in anesthetics, which because of its perfusion-limited properties means it's actually quite clinically important as it affects the diffusion of other gases such as oxygen. And because of how easily it can cross membranes, it can also fill up air-filled cavities, which makes it very clinically important in anesthesia, but we'll talk about this later as we get to it. So if we focus on diffusion-limited transfer, the gas we would classically use is carbon monoxide. So carbon monoxide actually crosses alveolar membranes very easily. However, once it enters the blood, it binds avidly to hemoglobin with an affinity that's around 210 times greater than oxygen. Because almost all the carbon monoxide binds immediately to hemoglobin, very little remains dissolved in plasma, and as a result, capillary partial pressure of carbon monoxide remains close to zero throughout the transit time. The pressure gradient between the alveolus and the blood therefore persists across the entire capillary length, and equilibration never occurs. This means that the rate of uptake depends entirely on diffusion properties of the membrane. Carbon monoxide, therefore, is a diffusion-limited gas, and this property is the reason why carbon monoxide is used clinically to measure diffusion capacity of the lungs. Simply, diffusion capacity is the net rate of gas transfer in mils per minute divided by the partial pressure gradient. Now, because the gradient is essentially zero within the blood, and then it's whatever you deliver to the lungs, you can almost just exclude the gradient in the blood and just have net rate of transfer in mils per minute divided by whatever the partial pressure gradient is that you're delivering to the lungs, because that is the gradient. If you were going to measure this clinically as a test of diffusion, the way it would work is that you'd get the patient to take a vital capacity breath of 0.3% carbon monoxide. They then hold their breath for 10 seconds, which gives you that time-dependent element to the measurement, and then it's exhaled. The inspired and expired carbon monoxide are measured, and the difference is the amount of carbon monoxide which is now bound to hemoglobin. And this gives you what's called the DLCO, so diffusion of the lungs through carbon monoxide, which is corrected for age, sex, and hemoglobin, as because it is so avidly bound to hemoglobin, if there's an anemia, it actually decreases the relative diffusion capacity. Things that would decrease your DLCO is a thickened alveolar-capillary barrier, so interstitial lung disease, for example, or reduced surface area, such as emphysema or pulmonary embolisms that reduce the blood flow to certain areas and create alveolar dead space. Lobectomies and pneumonectomies also decrease it. Things that increase it is exercise, because there's recruitment and distension of capillary membranes with increased blood flow. There's also alveolar hemorrhage, for example, as hemoglobin that's present within the lungs will also bind. You essentially have no barrier between the blood and the lungs then. And then obesity may also increase as well, and this is potentially due to that increased cardiac output. Now, when we do the measurement, as I mentioned, it's a volume per time over a partial pressure gradient. So a normal amount of carbon monoxide is 25 mil per minute per millimeter of mercury. But the result is normally shown to you as a percentage. For example, if it was reduced to 15 mil per minute per millimeter of mercury, that's 60% of normal, which is 25. And then this is further corrected for anemia, age, and gender. So overall, because of carbon monoxide not over equilibrating, the major limiting factor to its transfer across to blood is going to be the barrier, not new blood entering the capillary network. Where on the opposite end of the spectrum, if we talk about perfusion-limited gas exchange, nitrous oxide is a really good example because nitrous oxide also diffuses rapidly across the membrane, but it doesn't bind avidly to hemoglobin. It's also not very soluble in blood with a blood gas partition coefficient of 0.46, so it readily tries to leave blood if it's able to. And what this means is that its partial pressure in blood rises very quickly as it's not dissolved or bound, and within approximately 1/10 of the capillary transit time, alveolar and blood partial pressure becomes equal. Once equilibration has occurred, no further uptake can occur unless fresh blood arrives. Therefore, the limiting factor becomes blood flow rather than diffusion. So nitrous oxide is almost a purely perfusion-limited gas. Because of this, nitrous oxide also tries to leave blood really easily, which means that if there are air-filled cavities such as pneumothorax or pneumoperitoneums, if you were to use nitrous oxide as an anesthetic agent, it would leave the blood very rapidly and fill these air-filled cavities and expand them further, which also means that at the end of an anesthetic, when you turn the anesthetic off, it will also rapidly leave the blood into the alveoli, which expands the alveoli. And because of this expansion, the current partial pressure of the gases in the alveoli will decrease, as because we know from Dalton's law, which we discussed before, that all the gases must equal the partial pressure within the volume they occupy. So if the volume expands due to the nitrous oxide, it will dilute the other gases, and this can cause a diffusion hypoxia as well as cause more rapid drop in your PaCO2, which can inhibit respiratory drive, which further briefly worsens hypoxia as people will stop ventilating as well, which decreases the amount of new oxygen entering the alveoli, which further decreases that gradient for oxygen transfer. Now let's consider oxygen here. So mixed venous blood enters the pulmonary circulation with a PO2 of approximately 40 millimeters of mercury, and the alveolar PO2 is approximately 100 millimeters of mercury. This large gradient drives oxygen diffusion into the blood. As oxygen enters the capillary, hemoglobin rapidly binds it up, and within approximately 0.25 seconds, so 250 milliseconds, pulmonary capillary PO2 rises to match alveolar PO2. Remember that the total capillary transit time is around 0.75 seconds or 750 milliseconds. And what this means is that oxygen reaches equilibration after only 1/3 of the available transit time. Therefore, under normal circumstances, oxygen is perfusion limited, and if you increase pulmonary blood flow, oxygen uptake increases proportionally. Although oxygen is normally perfusion limited, it can become diffusion limited under certain circumstances. And during strenuous exercise, cardiac output increases dramatically, and red cells can move through the capillary network faster and faster. Transit time may fall from 0.75 seconds to as little as 0.25 seconds. Healthy lungs usually still achieve equilibration. However, if any diffusion abnormalities exist, there may not be enough time for oxygen tension to equalize. The second situation is high altitude. So at altitude, alveolar oxygen tension falls. This reduces the partial pressure gradient driving oxygen diffusion. In addition, blood remains on the steeper part of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, meaning oxygen partial pressure rises more slowly. During exercise at high altitude, oxygen may fail to equilibrate completely before blood leaves the capillary, and this is one of the few situations in which diffusion limitation can be demonstrated in healthy individuals. The third situation is thickening of the blood gas barrier. The examples include pulmonary edema and interstitial lung disease, where increasing the membrane thickness slows diffusion. And as a result, capillary oxygen tension may never reach alveolar oxygen tension before transit is complete. So oxygen becomes diffusion limited in these scenarios. Another way to talk about how oxygen diffuses into blood is to consider the diffusing capacity of the lungs. Now, previously we mentioned you used carbon monoxide for this, but you can also apply an equation to talk about oxygen as well. And what the equation ends up being is 1 over diffusion capacity of the lungs equals 1 over the resistance of the alveolar membrane to diffusion plus 1 over theta times volume of capillary blood. The theta represents the mil per minute of oxygen reaction with 1 mil of hemoglobin, and VC is our volume of blood in the capillaries. So diffusion capacity describes how effectively gas crosses the alveolar-capillary membrane. Essentially, it says a high diffusing capacity indicates efficient gas transfer, while a low diffusing capacity suggests impaired diffusion. An important concept is that oxygen transfer is limited by 2 separate resistances, and the first is that diffusion across the membrane, so on the left here, and the second is the time required for oxygen to bind to hemoglobin. So although hemoglobin binds rapidly, it's not instantaneous. As hemoglobin becomes saturated as well, capillary partial pressure of oxygen rises, which reduces the partial pressure gradient driving diffusion. In practice, the membrane resistance and hemoglobin reaction resistance contribute roughly equally to overall resistance to oxygen diffusion. And this explains why the membrane properties also affect oxygen transfer, as well as the time it takes for oxygen to bind to hemoglobin as well. And the volume of capillary blood in contact with the alveoli is also important because oxygen at first is perfusion limited, and then as those other properties are affected, it becomes diffusion limited. Despite in healthy lungs oxygen equilibrating, we still see a difference in your alveolar oxygen tension to your arterial oxygen tension, and this is known as the AA gradient, and it refers to this difference. In healthy lungs, alveolar PO2 is always slightly higher than arterial PO2, and this occurs because of physiological venous admixture, and a small amount of deoxygenated blood enters the systemic circulation through the bronchial veins, the Fabrician veins, and regions of low ventilation perfusion matching in the lungs. And as a result, the normal AA gradient is approximately 4 to 7 millimeters of mercury in young adults, but may increase to around 14 millimeters of mercury in the elderly. An increase in the AA gradient suggests impaired gas exchange or increased venous admixture, which can also be due to pathological shunts. So essentially relating this back to oxygen being perfusion and then becoming diffusion limited, as oxygen becomes diffusion limited due to diffusion defects, you'll have a rise in your AA gradient. Or if there's VQ mismatch, where you have lower ventilated parts of the lungs that will have a lower PaO2, meaning a decreased gradient for oxygen exchange, you have a slowing down of oxygen transfer, which will also increase your AA gradient. This can also happen again with shunt, where essentially there's no gradient or interaction with the alveoli, so you have an increased amount of shunt going to the left side of the circulation, which will also create a rise in your AA gradient. As you can see here, if you put shunt on your curve here, the oxygen will never be able to equilibrate with your partial pressure within the alveoli. So it will add deoxygenated blood to the arterial side of the circulation, which is essentially what venous admixture is. For carbon dioxide, it behaves somewhat differently from oxygen. Because carbon dioxide is approximately 20 times more diffusible than oxygen, it's rarely ever limited by diffusion. So generally, it's considered to be perfusion limited. However, in reality, CO2 is more dependent on diffusion barriers, but because it's so reliant on ventilation, as PaCO2 equals your production CO2 divided by your minute ventilation, and it's such a strong stimulant for respiratory drive, whenever there is a buildup of CO2 within the blood, it stimulates respiration, meaning that you increase your minute ventilation, which brings your PaCO2 back down. There's also an increased ability of the blood to carry CO2 compared to oxygen, meaning that your CO2 doesn't really rise as much as there's other buffers in place. So when you see a rise in your PaCO2, often it indicates a ventilatory failure, so a drop in your minute ventilation that's not meeting the demands required. And sometimes CO2 will actually be normal or low, especially in diseases such as interstitial lung disease, which poses a bigger barrier to oxygenation, as the hypoxic drive to meet the oxygen demands means that the patient needs to breathe with a higher respiratory rate, so they end up having a higher minute ventilation and will have a lower CO2. In emphysema, you may see people who start to CO2 trap, and this is because they lose a lot of their surface area of their lungs. but this is usually quite severe end-stage COPD for these patients. And they end up having a rise in the CO2, partially because they also get used to having a higher than normal CO2, so their body loses the sensitivity to CO2 to drive respiratory drive and rely more on hypoxic drive. So finally, let's discuss nitrogen, which often isn't actually used on this graph, but I want to put it on the graph just to demonstrate a point and talk about the nitrogen splint. So the nitrogen splint is what helps keep alveoli open. And we mentioned before how there's this deficit between CO2 and oxygen that leads to a 50 mil deficit with the alveoli that then shrink. Imagine if you had a gas such as nitrogen that was sitting there that also easily crossed the alveolar membrane. Then what would happen is that if that's crossing the alveolar membrane and there's nothing to replace that gas, then your alveoli would shrink even more and eventually you would get atelectasis and collapse. And this is the basis of what we call absorption atelectasis. And what this is that when you oxygenate someone, you put someone on high FiO2, you wash out all the nitrogen, so it's just oxygen sitting there. And this oxygen will rapidly cross to the blood, meaning that the volume of the alveoli will shrink because you've got nothing there or no gases there to hold the alveoli open then. So nitrogen being poorly soluble in blood and not easily crossing the alveolar membrane means that it will remain in the alveoli. So if you look at it in terms of this graph, it's going to remain almost a flat line all the way across the whole transit time of the alveoli and the blood, so it will remain within that space. And the partial pressure of nitrogen in the alveoli is about 569 millimeters of mercury, which isn't a problem at sea level because barely any of this nitrogen actually enters the blood. But in someone who's diving and is under a lot of pressure as they go down into the ocean, this nitrogen's relative partial pressure increases within the lungs and will then increase within the blood. And this isn't a problem if you remain at that level, except at extremes of depth where nitrogen itself can actually act as an anesthetic gas. But as you start to ascend, then all of a sudden the relative partial pressure decreases in the alveoli. Nitrogen will want to wash out into the lungs, but because it's so poorly diffusible into the lungs, it doesn't make it there in time and it will start to form bubbles within the blood. So it can form bubbles within joints and within tissues, and it can cause joint pain, neurological symptoms, respiratory dysfunction, and cardiovascular compromise. And this is known as decompression sickness or the bends. This is why people who are diving will use a more inert gas such as helium, which is about 1/5 as soluble as nitrogen, as the replacement gas to then act as the new nitrogen splint per se within the lungs and avoid nitrogen entering the blood, which lowers the risk of getting decompression sickness. So that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you for watching. If there's anything you want to add, anything you want to correct, feel free to add into the comments. But I really appreciate everyone watching these videos and providing feedback.